Welcome to Perspectives in Adventist Education. I'm your host, Stephen Brawley, Director of Secondary Education and Accreditation at the North American Division. Adventist education started in the late 1800s and has grown to operate programs from early childhood, elementary, secondary, and university levels, becoming the largest Protestant private school system in the world. Our graduates have become prominent thought leaders in all fields. Yet, few outside of the system know who we are and what we do. This series will seek out current voices to share how we are facing educational questions with an Adventist perspective. Today, Debbie Michel, Director of Communications for the Lake Union Conference and editor of the Lake Union Herald, interviews Michael Jefferson on stress reduction strategies for students.
Michael Jefferson, Pacific Union College.
Correct.
Tell us a little bit about yourself. What do you think our audience needs to know about you?
So I was born into the home of a pastor
Okay.
and a nurse.
Oh.
And I was also born into a family that has really deep Adventist education history. And so it's almost inevitable that I would move into education. It's not the direction my life originally started. It was more mental health, and then it pivoted. But it's been good. I ended up marrying a teacher, and an interesting story was that I was told by another teacher when we got engaged. She goes, you need to know if your wife's a teacher, you're going to be number 2 in her life.
Wow.
So I understand that now. And so we lived in Maryland for a long time.
Okay.
And then moved to Angwin, California to be at Pacific Union College. And our lives changed. And so that's one of the things I think that we need to be aware of, is that our lives are always changing, and change is neither good nor bad. It's what we make of it.
Gotcha.
And so then I started to be at home, not as much. My wife was home full-time with our kids, our 2 boys.
Oh, great.
And she'd been teaching, though, for probably 13, 14 years, and then just wanted to be home, raise the boys. And I went off to work, and then I was in education, higher education, and I was away from the house for 12 hours a day.
Wow.
And it was hard, to find that balance of work and being successful in a new job and education. Eventually, though, the kids grew up and we were able to make it work. So what do I want people to know about us is that, we've been through the struggle as well, and we've had successes and failures.
So what do you do at Pacific Union College today?
Today, I have 2 primary job descriptions. One is Associate Professor of Psychology, and the other is I am Director of Counseling, Career Disabilities, and we have a DOJ, Department of Justice, Office of Violence Against Women, grant against dating violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking prevention. So I'm a supervisor for that as well. So I have 2 big jobs.
Those are 2 big jobs and 2 important jobs.
Yeah.
And when I say important, what's in my mind is when I think about, you hear it in the media all the time, and parents who might be listening to this might have encountered that amongst their, whether it's teens, those in high school or in college, this mental health crisis that we keep hearing about. So you're there on the front lines, seeing it. Talk about that. What are we seeing, and what might be causing what we're seeing today?
Like anything, it's probably multivariable. There's a lot of different things that are impacting this. We actually saw the increase of mental health starting to tick up in 2010.
So more
So,
than a decade
so
ago.
more than a decade ago, if you look at the numbers and the data tracks were already starting to move up back in 2010. So I think what happened over COVID, and some people started referring to this as a pandemic brain. Over COVID, we saw individuals starting to isolate. We saw school systems shutting down temporarily while the country dealt with a pandemic. Everybody pivoted to online education. My
Zoom.
students, my students in college were attending classes in pajamas. They'd roll out of bed, and as long as the camera didn't pan up, they were good. And some of them would turn on their cameras and then mute their sound and mute their cameras, and then they would probably go back to sleep. And so I think we just got in a lot of bad habits.
So I want to go back a little bit because you said more than a decade ago
Yes.
we started seeing this uptick. And I'm curious to know what was tracking, I guess, at that time when you look at the numbers, why we saw that growth.
Well, I think one of the first things, the iPhone came out in 2007. So we didn't see much of an uptick. But when the social media apps came out in 2010, the apps started coming out, there's a correlation there. Now, correlation does not mean causation, but it is of interest. What's going on? And I don't think anybody really knows about why 2010 was a pivotal year for the exponential growth in mental health issues, especially with children and adolescents.
Yeah. So I'm curious to know, because you mentioned the pandemic and some of the effects that might have had on students. What is the research telling us at this point that might be informing you and your interest in this topic at this time?
So the research seems to indicate that as we move deeper and deeper into the pandemic, that we saw upticks in depression and anxiety in young children and adolescents, and that those numbers ultimately ended up doubling.
Yeah, I was reading some of those numbers, and I'll just share some of what I was looking at, and maybe they sound familiar to you, but K through 12, 7 out of 10 teens in the U.S., between the ages of 13 to 17, named anxiety or depression as a major problem among their peers in the community. Another statistic, 75% of U.S. high school students expressed boredom, anger, sadness, fear, or stress while in school. Another statistic, on a 10-point scale where normal values for adults are 3.8, American teens rated their stress rate on an average of 5.8. So normal would be 3.8. American teens are saying 5.8. And finally, in other academic pressure statistics, it was found that 75% of American high schools and half of middle schoolers describe themselves as, quote unquote, often feeling stressed by schoolwork. Alarming statistics that we're seeing. So talk about, what you've been seeing, and then I'd like for us to, because again, thinking about our audience, parents, how do we help our students?
Right. I think some of the data that I tend to track is the CDC, and these were published in, I think, JAMA back in 2022. It said that of this population, and this was a representation of a global representation. So this is not just to, the United States. This is to the globe. That prevalence rates had doubled, and that they were up to somewhere around 25% of children and adolescents experience depression, and 20% experience symptoms that would meet the criteria for an anxiety disorder. So these are not just individuals that are reporting, hey, I'm stressed, or hey, I'm feeling depressed, right? These are actually data points that indicate they meet criteria to be diagnosed with depression or anxiety. So we're talking about 1 out of every 4 is meeting criteria for depression.
Yeah.
1 out of every 5 is meeting criteria for anxiety.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think anxiety is continuing to creep up. That will be interesting as we move forward to see what happens with the anxiety numbers.
Right. And, I'm involved in youth ministry in my church.
Yeah.
I have a child. And so I'm not immune to what you're saying. I am seeing, what you are describing. And so for those who might be listening, and again, I'm thinking about those parents and who are thinking about it in the context of Adventist Christian education, is there anything that we should be doing, maybe from the perspective of, sending our children to, the schools and what they can expect? Is there mental health counseling in our schools? What can you tell us, and how can you reassure parents that there is help being provided for them necessarily?
So there's a lot of things that parents can do, but parents themselves are struggling with these things
Good point.
as well. And so,
Yep.
Do we have the energy? Do we have the skills to be able to help our children? I think the good news is that children are very resilient, and that there's some interesting data out that suggests that if you're just a good parent, your children are going to be fine. So I think the pressure on parents is we feel like we have to be perfect, and we don't.
Yeah.
And
we're usually looking, in social media, you're seeing the parents who are doing all the fantastic things.
They're setting the bar so high for us, right, that you're thinking, there's no way I can do that.
Yeah.
But there's an interesting data point that looked at what makes parenting successful. And it was this idea of that you're mirroring accurately the emotions of your children. That's the best predictor of successful parenting. So mirroring accurately the emotions of your children would be like if your child's sad, you're saying, oh, you're sad, I'm sorry, right? Or if they're happy, you're saying, this is great, you got a B in class. I know you had tried for an A, but you got a B. You're not saying, well, you could have got an A, right? So mirroring accurately the emotions of your children is the best predictor of successful parenting.
Really?
And I thought when I first learned that for myself, like, oh, I can do that.
Yeah, those are simple things.
That won't be that hard to mirror accurately the emotions of your children, because we think we have to do everything.
Yeah.
So I want parents to know that, be a good enough parent, mirror accurately the emotions of your children, encourage like a spiritual environment. Sometimes children push back on that, but like we try to encourage that in our children, engage them in church and be involved. I think that's important as well. What can parents do specifically to help the mental health of their children? I think let's go through some of the things I talked about in my presentation over this yesterday. I talked about family time. I read a study where 90% of parents say that having a meal together as a family decrease the stress and anxiety in their children.
Wow. 90%.
So consistent family time, because another point was that 50% of individuals report that they end up eating alone. And so maybe going back to, trying to carve out maybe 2 or 3 times a week to, have time to eat as a family.
And so for those parents, and I love these tips because they're practical. They're things whereby I can take this and I can try to implement them. Those who might be further down the road now to try to pull back whereby it's not been happening. any tips for?
Well, we're all in that, right? We all know what we need to do, right? But sometimes we just don't have the time or energy and to do it. And I think we can just start with baby steps. If you can't do it all perfect, just try something. I mentioned 10 different strategies in my presentation. And I talked about, you don't need to do all 10 to decrease the anxiety in your students. You don't need to do all 10 to decrease the anxiety in your children. All you need to do is 3.
Yeah, and you named about 3. And if you have others, please list them because, these are good.
Well, maybe
if you can remember.
They can put them on a slide here for us. Another one was to exercise. Exercise has been shown to be more effective than medication, more effective than meditation, more effective than counseling combined.
So for reducing
stress, anxiety, and depression. Exercise. So maybe as a family, start to encourage exercise. That's something I tried to start in my own life. I started to run about 4 years ago. I was just having a horrible time sleeping. And I was having that early morning wakefulness, which I knew was a sign of that things weren't really going well. And had a physician friend of mine said, well, you can go on medication or you can start to run and you can start to exercise. And so I found that for me, exercising, while it's not fun, I think the benefits of it are really enjoyable because I'm sleeping a lot better. I'm a lot more focused, have a lot more energy, etc. So I try to exercise about 3 to 4 times a week, and I run for about 4 miles. There was an interesting study that said if you're running outside or you're exercising outside next to green space or in green space, that it increases the efficacy of your exercise of about 20%. So I'm like, if I'm running about 4 miles and I'm running outdoors, well, maybe that's equivalent to running about 5 miles. So I think exercising is another really helpful strategy and encouraging our kids to get outside and be active. Another one I discussed was that I really like is the concept of doing random acts of kindness, which fits really nicely into our Christian worldview and being others focused. So there's good research to say individuals that have low levels of depression and anxiety in their life, those that report those, do about 3, on average, about 3 random acts of kindness a day. And random acts of kindness don't have to be, buying things for people. It can be simple. I say, opening up the door for a stranger, maybe sitting down with somebody and you only have a minute and they're talking to you longer and you're like, I really have to do other things, but you actually end up talking to them for 15. That could qualify for a random act of kindness. So it's being others focused is so important, and it takes our mind off ourselves.
That's right.
And I think that's one of the things that anxiety really does. It makes us very self-centered. Depression does too. And we know that being other-centered is so important in our own mental health. The older I've gotten, the more I've started to realize that mental health is not something that comes easy. When we're young, I feel like it came a lot easier for me. But the older I get, the more I start to feel like it's more intentional. I have to work at staying healthy. And maybe that's kind of this new normal that we live in. We need to start thinking about it just doesn't come easy, but if we work at it, we can achieve it.
Yeah. And another one of the strategies is gratitude.
Yeah, having gratitude. I used that when I talked about, doing some meditation. Be open to meditation, only for about 30 minutes, and having an attitude of gratitude, and also being curious. So those two combined, I love those. Just individuals that are curious and individuals that focus on gratitude typically have low levels of anxiety and depression. It's hard to, be anxious when you're having a heart full of gratitude for what God has done for us and will continue to do for us.
Yeah. I love these steps because they are simple. They are practical.
Yeah.
I don't feel like I need to, buy any expensive, piece of whatever it is to put it into practice. And so,
Another one we discussed was this concept of reframing. As a CBT therapist, that's kind of what I do. Is I think of counseling as learning how to think differently about your life. There's a whole genre of therapy. It's called existential therapy, and in that therapy, that's the whole goal of therapy, is just helping individuals think differently. They really don't care what you think differently about, just as long as you're thinking differently about something. But this idea of reframing, how important it is to reframe those negative thoughts that pop up into our head. And individuals with depression and anxiety typically will report having a lot more negative thoughts.
so give us an example.
I'm ugly. I'm not successful. I'm dumb.
How do you reframe that?
And what I tried to help my clients, and what I talked about at our presentation, was that we want to reframe things not as positive, but as reasonable and rational. If you look at yourself in the mirror in the morning and you say, oh my goodness, that's ugly, right? And you're like, okay, I learned in that seminar, I got to reframe this. And you look at yourself and, no, I'm beautiful. Your brain's going to be like, you're lying to me, all right? But if you say, the little work, it's going to look pretty good, So I'm going to do my hair, I'm going to brush my teeth, I'm going to take care of my activities of daily living. And individuals, you can look, we all look really fairly well with a little work. So I try to be reasonable and rational in my thoughts. And so something I teach my clients, and I taught my breakout group, was how to think reasonably and rationally. So if you're hyper, right? Individuals that are hyper, well, how do you reframe hyper?
Yep. How do you do that?
Creative, right? Or distractible, right? Busy. If I'm very distracted, I'm busy. So trying to reframe things is really fundamental, I think, to building a kind of a scaffold of mental health. There's an interesting data point, a research that was done, I think is like 2012. And it's like one of my favorite studies on this area. And what they did is they surveyed a large population of individuals, and they asked them two questions. First question was, how stressed are you on a scale of 1 to 10? And the second question is, do you think stress is helpful or harmful? Right. And I think the specific question was, do you think stress is harmful? Yes or no? And then what they did is they tracked these individuals for the next 8 years and were identified who died and who didn't. And what they found from the study was that individuals that reported that they had high levels of stress, but said that stress was not harmful, were least likely to die.
Wow.
And so these individuals were actually reframing, right? They were saying, no, stress is not harmful to me. It's just a part of life. And individuals that reported moderate levels of stress, but said that it was harmful, were the most likely to die. So for me, that's this idea of hey, you're rethinking something. You're you're reframing it. You're
Yeah.
putting it in a different perspective. You're saying that stress doesn't have to be something that is damaging. We can think about situations in our lives that we've had that have been stressful. Like probably the most stressful situation I've ever been through was my wedding. You know, probably the least stressful day of my life was after my wedding. So, but was that a bad experience? No, that was a great experience. So I think that's something that we can do is, think about stress, but start teaching our children that stress is not bad, because now we have this it's so popular in our culture to talk about stress, and students will send me emails the night before an exam saying, "I'm just stressed. Please excuse me. I need a mental health day." And I'm like, when did mental health days become a thing? I know personal days are a thing, but so I think normalizing is another thing I talked about in my presentation.
Okay.
We need to normalize that, stress, especially as we move into the end times. As a kind of a Christian community, we have this idea that we're not going to be here forever.
Right.
And that Christ is going to come soon. As we move closer and closer to that point, I think life is going to get more and more stressful.
Yeah. So we have to learn how to
Yeah.
cope with it.
Right.
I'm learning so much from you with this interview in terms of reframing and looking at stress not necessarily as something whereby it's bad, I need to avoid it, although, we don't want to take on too much stress, and sometimes we do.
We need good
bring it on.
boundaries.
Right.
We need to be able to say no.
Having those boundaries.
That's a hard word to use, though.
Yeah.
To say no.
Yeah, but in terms of managing
Yeah.
that stress, this is fascinating. I'm enjoying this conversation with you because I feel like, I've not done therapy, but I feel like this is something that's therapeutic and very helpful. And I don't know if there's anything else that you have not shared, but I think that the information that you've given so far is very helpful for someone like myself as a parent in terms of steps I can take today to help my family, help my children, my child, to better cope in the world.
One of the things my mom would say to me is when I had children, she would say, I should have prayed more and worried less. And I'm not trying to say that prayer is the answer to everything, but it's got to be part of a collection of things that we use to manage our stress, to tap into the divine, to give what is uncontrollable over to God and let Him take on what we can't. And I think so I always have my mom's voice in the back of my head, like, I should have prayed more and worried less. Maybe that would have helped me sleep a lot better. Because I think sleep is also a great strategy and something that we don't often talk about. But sleep is one of the major pandemic and the mental health crisis that we have going on. People aren't sleeping.
But they can't sleep. So how do you say sleep?
Exactly. I think we have a lot of distractions, right? And we take our phones to bed. I'm guilty, right? But I wonder what it would be like if we didn't have technology in our bedrooms. Maybe have a basket on the kitchen table. You have to put the technology in that. But then some of us are on call, right, 24/7, and so it's hard.
Yeah.
But I think sleep, because when I get a solid 9 hours of sleep, man, nothing phases me. I can conquer a lot.
Yeah.
But when you only get 6, the little things stress me out.
Yeah. More aggravated life.
Yeah. Or you're quicker to get aggravated. Oh, interesting data point. If you get 1 hour of sleep less than your required minimum, which for me is about 8 to 8.5, and I think that's pretty average. Children are a little bit more. Teens are more because they need more sleep. For every hour that you get less, you're less likely to do those random acts of kindness for others. Yeah.
And so it snowballs, not having to sleep and not doing those things that would help you
Exactly.
cope with
Exactly.
the stress.
Exactly.
Wow. Michael, it's been a pleasure. I have learned a lot, and we've been able to discuss really good strategies for parents.
Yeah.
I feel encouraged. I feel like, you know what? I can conquer the world with just a few things: getting enough sleep, being grateful for the life I have, to show kindness to others, getting my exercise. A lot of this stuff and praying, it's sounding so familiar to what our church has been preaching.
That's not a surprise. The more I kind of think about some of our messages, and I would love to see our church kind of repackage this, is our message is protective, like for our mental health.
Yeah.
It's not a list of do's and don'ts, right? It's a message of protecting our mental health and our physical health as well,
Right.
because you can't pull those apart.
Yeah.
One feeds the other.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
This has been great. I really, really appreciate this. And I know that the information will go a long way to helping families. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
This is Stephen Brawley, your host. Thanks for listening. Join us again next time as we explore more perspectives in Adventist education.
An Adventist Learning Community podcast.